Okay, this is the Civil War Objective 1 about why the Civil War started badly for the Union and what the impact of the Emancipation Proclamation was. And one little side note I want to throw in here on letter A, actually two side notes. The war takes place from 1861 to 65, we know that, but you may hear the terms Army of the Potomac or Army of Northern Virginia. If you hear Army of the Potomac, they're talking about the Union because the Potomac River runs through Washington, D.C. If you hear the Army of Northern Virginia, they're talking about the Confederacy because Richmond, their new capital after Virginia joined the Confederacy, was in Northern Virginia. So if you hear the Army of Northern Virginia, that's the Confederates. Now, the war itself was viewed by many, including Lincoln, to be a very simple affair. The North had all the resources, the Confederates did not. There'd be one or two battles, and the rebels would be crushed. Lincoln believed that, and so did everybody else. The problem was that the war ends up lasting 4 years. When it's all said and done, there's going to be over 600,000 dead, another 500,000 wounded, and with no disrespect to other wars, it's the most major calamity that American military history has ever seen in terms of deaths. World War II would give us 200,000 dead, and Vietnam in 8 years would give us 58,000 dead. But in any event, people thought it would be over quickly. They were wrong. In the very first battle between the Union, which called it the Battle of Bull Run because Bull Run Creek, and they used to name things after bodies of water, and the Confederates, who referred to it as the Battle of Manassas because they named things after the nearest town, the Union was supposed to show their superiority. Very first battle of the war, Bull Run. Well, everybody there who showed up usually did so with picnic baskets and things like that, because in those days, civilians were not targets. You could watch a battle from a hillside like you were watching a football game. And so they show up to watch the Union crush the South and have this little rebellion end. Well, that's not the way it turned out. When it was all said and done, the Confederacy actually wins, and the Union retreats embarrassed. You can read what one observer said right here. Now, Lincoln is understandably upset at everything that happens here, so he puts a new general in charge, a brilliant military strategist and instructor named George McClellan, who was idolized by his men because he would not really sacrifice them unless he absolutely had to, and they affectionately called him Little Mac. The only thing is that McClellan was a perfectionist, and that often meant he was overly cautious. Most times he would not march until he thought everything was absolutely perfect right down to the last button, and he usually felt like he was outnumbered by the other side even when he wasn't. So unless he could get an absolute victory with no casualties, McClellan was very skittish about marching ahead. He wasn't a coward by any means, just overly cautious. And that didn't set well with Lincoln, who used to refer to McClellan as Tardy George. McClellan, by his side of things, was very arrogant to Lincoln, and behind his back used to refer to him as Baboon. At one point, as you can see here, Lincoln asks if he can borrow the army since they're not being used, which didn't make McClellan very happy either. Now, Lincoln orders McClellan to attack Richmond, the Confederate capital, in what became known as the Peninsula Campaign. Now, the problem with that is that McClellan doesn't really want to go. So on his way to Richmond, what he does is follow this path right here. Leaving Washington, D.C., McClellan goes down this path here along the water, and this is why it's called the Peninsula Campaign, because you can see the peninsula forming here. And he goes up here and stops, which is kind of classic McClellan. He sits there and watches rebel scouts literally circle his encampment and see what he's doing and refuses to attack right away. When he eventually does attack, Lee is well informed and pushes McClellan back from Richmond. Lincoln isn't very happy about this and removes McClellan from command after what he sees as a missed opportunity to end the war early. He will eventually bring McClellan back, and they are going to have a history with each other throughout this war, as you'll find out later. Now, despite the early problems, they did have a solid plan in place. General Scott had incorporated what was called the Anaconda Plan. Now, an anaconda, as you know, is something that crushes and squeezes, and what they were trying to do here was do that to the south. They put a naval blockade all around the outside of the southern borders, closing off all ports that they could and everything else. And in simple terms, they were going to crush the South by dividing it into thirds, taking the Mississippi River and eventually marching through Georgia and starving them out with sheer resources and numbers. Now, that meant that a war at sea was critical. And then the Confederates came out with this ship that you see in this picture right here. It used to be called the Merrimac when it was a wooden ship, but what they did was add steel plates to it, or iron plating, I should say. Steel wasn't quite around yet on this level. And they renamed it the Virginia. Now, the Virginia goes around and actually sinks two Union ships in the blockade. Now, this freaks out the Union a bit, so they come up with their own ship called the Monitor. It was built in just 100 days after the Merrimac destroyed two of the Union ships off Chesapeake Bay, just outside of Richmond, just heading into the Atlantic. And as you can see, it's kind of a funny-looking boat. It was described by someone as a cheese box on a raft. The crew, however, of the Monitor had a lot of faith in it, and they were more than willing to take it into battle. Again, it was right down to the water level, so I have no idea why it didn't sink, but it proved to be very seaworthy and an able rival to the Merrimac. Now, the two ships only met each other in battle one time. The Monitor and the Merrimac fought to a draw in Chesapeake Bay in a battle that has become somewhat mythological with historians. Both of them managed to get their punches in, but like I said, inevitably it ends up in a draw. Now, the Monitor went its separate way and stayed in service for a while. The Merrimac actually was docked, and later on in the war, Union soldiers were approaching it, so the Confederates decided to destroy it to make sure it didn't fall into Union hands. So after struggling at Bull Run and on the Peninsula Campaign, and barely holding off a threat to his naval blockade, Lincoln thinks he needs a very decisive victory, and he decides he's going to try to get that victory at a place called Antietam Creek, Maryland. Now, the Battle of Antietam happens right here. The Confederates called it the Battle of Sharpsburg because that was the nearest town, but the Union called it the Battle of Antietam Creek. Antietam is going to end up being the bloodiest day in U.S. history, with 23,000 soldiers killed or wounded between the two sides. Now, at this point, McClellan is back in command, and for a cautious guy who doesn't like to sacrifice his troops, this was pretty devastating. 23,000 lost, as you can see here in post-battlefield pictures, made Antietam one of the most devastating wars in American history, and definitely a devastating war in the Civil War itself, devastating battle in the Civil War itself. The problem, after all this, you would think if there was this much sacrifice that they would try to end the war quickly. But McClellan again refuses to chase Lee after the battle. He's got him on the run, won't chase him, and as a result, Lincoln removes him from his command again. However, the battle did give Lincoln a reason to take a next bold step, and that happened in January 1863. It was the Emancipation Proclamation. And after months of saying that he wasn't going to make the war about slavery so he could keep the border states, he finally does. He announces in the Emancipation means freedom, and to proclaim is to say. And Lincoln says in the Emancipation Proclamation that the war will indeed be about freeing the slaves. As a result, about 180,000 African Americans joined the Union Army, but they're not necessarily welcomed in. They were subjected to a lot of racism, even in the North, because not everybody is an abolitionist. There were a lot of people that were fighting just to restore the Union. So to say that everybody wanted to free the slaves, or that everybody even liked African Americans, particularly the Irish people that were in the Army at that time, is a bit of a misnomer. However, they should be recognized because African American soldiers did fight bravely. The most famous African American regiment was the 54th out of Massachusetts, led by a guy named Robert Gould Shaw. Now, Shaw was very young and only got this command because no one else really wanted to do it, but it did promote him to general, and he was an abolitionist from Boston with very wealthy parents who had great political connections. Now, what the 54th is most famous for is their assault on Fort Wagner, which they volunteered for. Fort Wagner was in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, and there was only one way to really approach it, with a swamp on one side over here, and ocean on this side over here. You were going to have to go single file into it, and the leading regiment was going to take the majority of the casualties while everybody rallied in behind them. In essence, somebody had to go up front and be a human wall. The 54th volunteered to do that and lost over half of its number on the assault. Now, Shaw himself, and you can see in this painting as it's depicted, was reported to have died when they went over the wall to actually go into the fort. You'll see different instances of this in the movie Glory, which is about the 54th, but by all accounts, Shaw leads these troops up and dies trying to get over the wall. The troops themselves do get over the wall and make their way into the fort, fighting valiantly, but in the end, nobody could take the fort. The assault was unsuccessful, and the Confederates kept Fort Wagner. However, the story of the 54th would be recorded in history and give a lot of prominence and glory to African Americans who fought in the war. Today, you can see a monument to Shaw and the 54th in Boston, Massachusetts. And Shaw is remembered fondly by abolitionists all over the country. When he died, he was buried with his troops in the sand in a mass grave outside of Fort Wagner, and his parents were given the opportunity to have him dug up and brought home for a proper burial. His parents refused, saying that Shaw would have wanted to be buried with his men, which was an honorable response by parents of an honorable man. Okay, so that's it. Thanks for watching.